August 10, 1945, 0630 hours, training field outside Kagoshima, Kyushu. 14-year-old Michiko Tanaka crawled through the dirt toward the rusted Type 96 machine gun, her school uniform torn and dusty from weeks of military drilling. Around her, 40 other schoolgirls practiced the same movement, approaching enemy positions with weapons they barely understood, preparing to die in battles that would never come. "When the American demons land on our shores," shouted Sergeant Watanabe, their military instructor, "you must fight until your last breath. Death before dishonor. Protect the divine emperor." Michiko gripped the machine gun's handles, her small fingers trembling not from fear of the Americans, but from hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. None of them had. The great Japanese empire that was supposed to feed its people was reduced to training children with obsolete weapons and empty promises of glorious death. What Michiko and her classmates didn't know was that, at that very moment, 800 miles away in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his cabinet to discuss surrender terms. The war they were preparing to die fighting had already been lost. Not just tactically, but so completely that Japan's leaders understood continued resistance would mean the total extinction of their civilization. For millions of Japanese civilians who spent the summer of 1945 sharpening bamboo spears and rehearsing suicidal charges against an invasion that would never come. The ultimate tragedy was not death in battle, but the realization that their sacrifice had been rendered meaningless before they could even make it. The delusion of resistance. The Japanese government's campaign to mobilize civilian resistance during the final months of World War II represented one of history's most systematic efforts to prepare an entire population for mass suicide in service of a cause that had already been lost. The program was comprehensive, fanatical, and built entirely on lies about Japan's strategic situation. The Volunteer Fighting Corps, established by imperial decree in June 1945, conscripted every Japanese civilian between the ages of 15 and 60 into military service. The organization existed only on paper. There were no uniforms, no regular weapons, no training facilities, and no realistic prospect of military effectiveness against American forces. What existed instead was propaganda that transformed desperation into zealotry. Radio broadcasts, neighborhood meetings, and school assemblies repeated the same message. American invasion was imminent. Defeat was impossible if the Japanese people remained united. And death fighting the enemy was the highest honor any Japanese could achieve. The mathematical reality was starkly different. By August 1945, Japan possessed no effective navy, virtually no air force, and an army that existed primarily as scattered garrisons with inadequate supplies and obsolete equipment. American forces commanded overwhelming superiority in every category of military power while operating from secure bases that Japanese forces couldn't threaten. The weapons of desperation. The arms provided to Japan's civilian militia revealed the complete collapse of Japanese industrial capacity and military logistics. The bamboo spears that became symbols of final resistance weren't chosen for their effectiveness. They were literally the only weapons Japan could produce in sufficient quantities to arm millions of civilians. Blacksmiths throughout Japan received orders to convert farming implements into weapons of war. Kitchen knives were mounted on wooden poles. Garden tools were sharpened into crude spears. Anything that could conceivably inflict injury on an American soldier was distributed to civilians who had never received meaningful military training. The few actual firearms available to civilian units were museum pieces. Rifles from the Russo-Japanese War, machine guns that hadn't been manufactured since the 1920s, pistols without ammunition. Most armed civilians possessed nothing more than pointed sticks, and the promise that their sacrifice would somehow compensate for Japan's technological inferiority. Training exercises revealed the pathetic inadequacy of Japan's civilian defense preparations. Elderly men practiced charging imaginary American tanks with bamboo spears. Teenage girls learned to operate machine guns they would never actually fire in combat. Children rehearsed grenade attacks using rocks and empty cans. The psychology of sacrifice. The willingness of Japanese civilians to embrace suicidal resistance reflected psychological conditioning that had transformed rational self-preservation into ideological fanaticism. Years of propaganda had convinced ordinary people that death-fighting Americans was preferable to life under foreign occupation. The conditioning was particularly effective among children and teenagers who had known no reality other than wartime propaganda. School curricula emphasized death before dishonor, with detailed instruction on how to kill American soldiers using improvised weapons before dying themselves. Schoolgirl Michiko Tanaka genuinely believed that fighting to the death against American invaders was her sacred duty as a Japanese citizen. "We were taught that Americans would torture us, rape us, kill our families," she recalled decades later. Death fighting them seemed like mercy compared to what they would do to us if we survived. The psychological preparation for mass suicide was systematic and thorough. Families received instructions for killing themselves if capture seemed inevitable. Mothers were taught to strangle their children rather than allow them to fall into American hands. Fathers learned to use grenades to destroy their entire families rather than submit to occupation. The strategic impossibility. Japanese military leaders who promoted civilian resistance understood perfectly well that bamboo spears couldn't stop American tanks and that teenage girls with machine guns posed no serious threat to combat veterans who had fought across the Pacific. The civilian mobilization was never intended to achieve military victory. It was designed to make American invasion so costly that the United States would accept negotiated peace rather than total Japanese surrender. The strategy was based on fundamental misunderstanding of American character and industrial capacity. Japanese planners assumed that American democracy would collapse under casualty rates that totalitarian Japan was prepared to accept. They calculated that Japanese willingness to die would exceed American willingness to kill. The assumption proved disastrously wrong. American planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, included provisions for dealing with civilian resistance that demonstrated cold-blooded realism about the human cost of Japanese fanaticism. American commanders were prepared to kill as many Japanese civilians as necessary to achieve unconditional surrender. More importantly, American strategic planners had already developed alternatives to invasion that made Japanese civilian resistance irrelevant. The atomic bomb program, strategic bombing campaign, and naval blockade provided ways to achieve Japanese surrender without exposing American forces to the casualties that Japanese leaders hoped would force negotiated peace. The reality of American power. While Japanese civilians trained with bamboo spears, American forces deployed military capabilities that exceeded Japanese comprehension. The scale of American industrial production, technological advancement, and logistical capacity made Japanese resistance mathematically meaningless, regardless of individual courage or sacrifice. American naval forces operating off the Japanese coast included over 1,200 warships, with firepower sufficient to destroy every major Japanese city within weeks. The Fast Carrier Task Force alone could launch more aircraft than the entire remaining Japanese Air Force possessed, while maintaining operations indefinitely through supply systems that Japanese forces couldn't threaten. Strategic bombing capabilities had already demonstrated American ability to destroy Japanese cities at will. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, killed more people in a single night than most military campaigns throughout history. The systematic destruction of Japanese urban areas proved that American forces could eliminate Japanese civilization without risking a single soldier in ground combat. The Manhattan Project represented technological capabilities that Japanese science had never approached. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not desperate weapons of a failing war effort, but demonstrations of American scientific and industrial supremacy that could be replicated indefinitely. The training charade military training provided to Japanese civilians represented elaborate theater designed to maintain morale rather than genuine preparation for effective resistance. The exercises were psychologically important for maintaining civilian willingness to fight, but militarily worthless against forces equipped with modern weapons and proper training. Drill instructors teaching civilian militias often possessed no actual combat experience and little understanding of modern warfare. Many were retired soldiers from previous conflicts who had never faced enemies equipped with automatic weapons, artillery, or air support. Their training methods reflected outdated concepts of warfare that bore no resemblance to the industrial killing that characterized World War II combat. The weapons training was particularly absurd. Civilians learned to operate machine guns using wooden models, practiced throwing grenades with stones, and rehearsed anti-tank tactics against imaginary vehicles. The training was based on equipment that didn't exist, and scenarios that could never occur given Japan's actual military situation. Physical conditioning emphasized fanatical determination rather than practical military skills. Civilians learned to charge while screaming, practiced dying dramatically for the emperor, and rehearsed mass suicide techniques that would prevent capture by American forces. The training was preparation for death, not combat. The Children's Army. The mobilization of Japanese children for military resistance represented the most morally bankrupt aspect of Japan's final defense preparations. Children as young as 12 received training in guerrilla warfare, suicide bombing, and assassination techniques that were intended to turn schoolyards into battlefields. Student military training units practiced attacking American soldiers using methods that violated every international law regarding child combatants. Boys learned to hide explosives and detonate them when American patrols approached. Girls practiced seducing American soldiers before killing them with concealed weapons. The psychological damage inflicted on children through militarization was devastating and permanent. Many never recovered from conditioning that taught them to value death over life and violence over peaceful resolution of conflicts. The education system that should have prepared children for productive civilian lives instead prepared them for suicidal military operations. Teachers who implemented military training programs often understood the futility of what they were teaching, but continued because refusal meant execution for defeatism. The systematic corruption of childhood education represented institutional child abuse on a national scale. The women's sacrifice. Japanese women were expected to play crucial roles in civilian resistance, despite having no military training, inadequate weapons, and family responsibilities that made combat participation impossible. The expectations placed on women revealed the complete disconnect between Japanese planning and battlefield reality. Women's organizations received instructions for conducting sabotage operations against American supply lines, assassination attempts against American commanders, and suicide bombing attacks on American installations. These missions required training, equipment, and support that simply didn't exist. More realistically, women were expected to kill their own children rather than allow them to be captured by American forces. Mothers received detailed instructions for using various methods to murder their families before committing suicide themselves. The systematic preparation for infanticide represented the moral nadir of Japanese wartime conditioning. The few women who possessed actual military training, nurses, communications operators, clerical personnel, were assigned to combat units where they were expected to fight alongside men despite lacking appropriate equipment or tactical knowledge. Their deployment represented desperation rather than sound military planning. The industrial collapse. The Japanese economy's complete inability to support civilian resistance revealed the extent of industrial collapse that made continued warfare impossible regardless of popular determination to fight. The resources necessary for equipping and sustaining millions of civilian fighters simply didn't exist. Food production had fallen to levels that couldn't sustain the existing population, much less support additional military operations. Civilians who were supposed to fight American invaders were already dying from malnutrition and diseases that proper nutrition could have prevented. Transportation systems had been destroyed by bombing to the point where moving supplies from one region to another required weeks rather than days. Civilian militias would have been isolated in their local areas without possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Medical care for civilians wounded in resistance operations would have been impossible given the collapse of Japanese medical infrastructure. The systematic destruction of hospitals, medical schools, and pharmaceutical production meant that wounded resistance fighters would have died from injuries that proper medical attention could have treated successfully. The atomic reality. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, demonstrated American technological capabilities that made Japanese resistance meaningless, regardless of civilian determination or military preparation. The weapons represented power that transcended conventional military categories. The immediate destruction of two entire cities with single weapons proved that American forces could eliminate Japanese civilization without risking casualties among their own personnel. The prospect of dozens or hundreds of additional atomic attacks made civilian resistance strategically pointless. Japanese leaders who had promoted civilian resistance as a way to increase American casualties were forced to confront the reality that Americans possessed weapons that eliminated Japanese ability to inflict casualties in return. The atomic bomb made Japanese threats of costly resistance empty bluffs that couldn't influence American strategic calculations. The psychological impact of atomic weapons on Japanese civilian morale was immediate and devastating. Communities that had been prepared to fight to the death suddenly faced the prospect of instantaneous annihilation that rendered individual courage irrelevant. The surrender decision. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender on August 15, 1945, was based on recognition that continued resistance would result in the complete extinction of Japanese civilization without achieving any meaningful military or political objectives. The atomic bombings had proven that American power exceeded Japan's ability to resist or retaliate. The surrender announcement reached Japanese civilian militias who had been preparing for final battles that would never occur. Millions of people who had accepted death as inevitable suddenly faced the prospect of survival under foreign occupation that propaganda had taught them was worse than death. The transition from preparation for mass suicide to acceptance of occupation required psychological adjustments that many civilians never successfully completed. The collapse of ideological certainty left individuals without frameworks for understanding their place in a world where everything they had believed was proven wrong. Military units that had been preparing civilian resistance operations faced the task of explaining to their members why sacrifice was no longer necessary or desired. The systematic reversal of months of conditioning created confusion and resentment that persisted long after the war's formal end. The occupation revelation. American occupation of Japan revealed the complete inaccuracy of propaganda that had conditioned civilians to expect torture, rape, and systematic brutality from enemy forces. The reality of American administration challenged every assumption that had justified civilian resistance preparations. American occupation policies emphasized reconstruction rather than punishment, providing food, medical care, and economic assistance to populations that had been prepared to die fighting their benefactors. The contrast between expected brutality and actual kindness created cognitive dissonance that forced fundamental re-evaluation of wartime beliefs. General Douglas MacArthur's administration implemented democratic reforms and humanitarian programs that exceeded what Japanese government had provided to its own people during peacetime. The occupation demonstrated that American rule offered advantages that Japanese military government had never delivered. Civilians who had trained to kill Americans found themselves working alongside American personnel who treated them with respect and provided opportunities for rebuilding their lives. The collaboration that developed between former enemies proved that propaganda about irreconcilable racial differences had been lies designed to prevent cooperation. The human cost. The psychological trauma inflicted on Japanese civilians through militarization and preparation for mass suicide created lasting damage that affected individuals and communities for decades after the war ended. Many never recovered from conditioning that valued death over life and violence over peaceful cooperation. Children who had been trained to kill and die for the emperor struggled to adapt to peaceful civilian life that required cooperation rather than conflict. Educational programs designed to undo military conditioning often proved inadequate for addressing psychological damage that went beyond simple re-education. Families that had prepared for mass suicide faced complex guilt about their willingness to kill their own children for ideological purposes. The realization that such sacrifice would have been meaningless created psychological burdens that many parents carried throughout their lives. Communities that had devoted months to military preparation faced the challenge of rebuilding social institutions that had been militarized beyond recognition. The transition from preparation for death to planning for life required social healing that took years to achieve. The strategic lessons. The Japanese civilian resistance program demonstrated the futility of ideological fanaticism when confronted with overwhelming material disadvantage. No amount of individual courage or willingness to die could compensate for industrial and technological inferiority that made resistance mathematically impossible. American strategic planning that developed alternatives to invasion proved more effective than Japanese preparation for costly defensive battles. The combination of atomic weapons, strategic bombing, and naval blockade achieved Japanese surrender without the casualties that Japanese leaders hoped would force negotiated peace. The systematic indoctrination of civilian populations for suicidal resistance proved counterproductive when superior enemy forces possessed the technological capability to achieve victory without engaging in costly ground combat. Japanese preparation for heroic death became irrelevant when Americans chose technological solutions over infantry assault. International observers who studied Japanese civilian militarization concluded that democratic societies possessed strategic advantages over totalitarian regimes that extended beyond simple industrial capacity to include realistic assessment of strategic situations and rational decision-making processes. The educational impact. Post-war educational programs in Japan used examples of civilian resistance preparations to teach about the dangers of militarism and the importance of critical thinking in evaluating government claims about national security. The systematic examination of wartime delusions became part of democratic education. International educational institutions used Japanese civilian militarization as case studies in propaganda analysis, mass psychology, and the relationship between ideology and strategic thinking. The historical example provided concrete evidence of how entire populations pride in their willingness to sacrifice and recognition that their sacrifice would have been meaningless. The memory became complicated evidence of both human devotion and human folly. The bamboo spears that had symbolized Japanese determination to resist became museum artifacts that reminded visitors about the futility of ideological fanaticism when confronted with overwhelming material superiority. The weapons served as warnings about the consequences of unrealistic strategic planning. Educational programs that used civilian resistance preparations as historical examples emphasized the importance of accurate information and rational decision-making in evaluating national security threats. The systematic deception of civilian populations became cautionary tales about government propaganda. Peace memorial activities often included references to civilian resistance training as evidence of how wartime conditioning could transform ordinary people into instruments of violence and self-destruction. The memory served arguments for diplomatic solutions to international conflicts. The final recognition. In the end, Japanese civilians who prepared to die fighting a war that America had already won represented the tragic human cost of leadership that valued symbolic resistance over realistic assessment of strategic possibilities. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves for impossible objectives demonstrated both the nobility and futility of human determination when divorced from rational analysis. The bamboo spears they carried into training fields became monuments to misguided courage that achieved nothing while costing everything. The children who learned to use weapons they would never fire in anger grew up to understand that peace offered possibilities that war could never provide. The American forces they had been conditioned to fear, as demons proved to be human beings who preferred reconstruction to destruction, cooperations could be deceived about fundamental realities. Peace education programs emphasized the tragic waste of human potential represented by civilian resistance training that prepared people for death rather than productive life. The example became powerful arguments for diplomatic solutions to international conflicts. Military academies studied Japanese civilian resistance as examples of how not to conduct defensive operations, emphasizing the importance of realistic assessment of relative capabilities and rational strategic planning based on actual rather than desired conditions. The ultimate irony. The ultimate irony of Japanese civilian resistance preparations lay in the fact that the invasion they were designed to resist never occurred precisely because American leaders understood that Japanese fanaticism made invasion unnecessary, costly, when alternative strategies could achieve the same political objectives more efficiently. President Harry Truman's decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade Japan was influenced partly by estimates of casualties that would result from fighting civilian populations that had been conditioned to prefer death over surrender. Japanese preparation for mass resistance actually contributed to American decisions that made their sacrifice unnecessary. The weapons that Japanese civilians had trained to use against American invaders were never tested in combat because American technological superiority eliminated the need for invasion. The bamboo spears and improvised explosives remained unused symbols of determination that became irrelevant before it could be demonstrated. The children who had been taught to kill American soldiers instead learned to play baseball with American occupation troops who brought candy and medical care, rather than the brutality that propaganda had promised. The transformation from preparation for war to enjoyment of peace occurred without the intermediate stage of combat that both sides had expected. The memory and meaning. Decades after the war ended, survivors of Japanese civilian resistance training reflected on their experiences with mixture of preparation to conflict and building futures to destroying pasts. The revelation challenged every assumption that had justified preparation for mass suicide. The war that Japanese civilians prepared to fight had indeed already been won, not just militarily but morally, by a side that possessed both the power to destroy its enemies and the wisdom to choose reconstruction over revenge. The ultimate victory belonged not to those who were willing to die, but to those who chose to let their enemies live, and discover that former foes could become friends when hatred gave way to hope, and preparation for death was replaced by commitment to life.